For years, David had asked questions that seemed to disappear into heaven without answers, questions whispered in caves, questions carried through deserts, questions soaked with tears, questions wrapped in exhaustion. And now, standing among the ashes of Ziklag, he faced a choice every believer eventually faces. Would he interpret God's silence as abandonment, or would he trust that God was still working beyond what he could see? The answer would change everything. The Bible tells us that David sought the Lord, not because his emotions felt strong, not because his circumstances suddenly improved, but because he had reached the end of himself. And sometimes, that is exactly where God begins. For years, David had been learning lessons he did not fully understand. Lessons about patience, lessons about dependence, lessons about surrender. Now those lessons were finally being tested, not in theory, in reality, because when everything burns, only what is real survives. David asked God a simple question: shall I pursue them? Imagine the significance of that moment. After years of silence, David still asked. He still sought God's direction. He still believed God had something to say. And this time, God answered. The silence broke. Not because David demanded it, not because David earned it, because the season had finally accomplished its purpose. The answer came clearly: pursue them. You shall surely overtake them. And without fail, recover all. Recover all. Those words must have sounded impossible. His city was gone. His family was gone. Everything seemed lost. Yet God spoke restoration before David could see evidence of it. And perhaps that is how faith often works. God speaks victory while circumstances still look defeated. God speaks hope while darkness still surrounds us. God speaks restoration while ashes still cover the ground. The journey that followed was exhausting. David and his men pursued the raiders through difficult terrain. The distance was long, the uncertainty remained. Some of the men became too exhausted to continue. Think about that. Even after receiving God's promise, the struggle did not immediately disappear. That is important. Many people believe faith eliminates difficulty. Scripture teaches something different. Faith often gives strength to walk through difficulty, and David kept moving, step after step, hour after hour, holding on to a promise he could not yet see fulfilled. Then something remarkable happened. They encountered an abandoned servant, a man discarded by the very people David was pursuing, someone forgotten, someone overlooked, someone the enemy considered useless. And unexpectedly, this forgotten man became the key to finding everything David had lost. Perhaps there is a lesson hidden there. God often uses what others overlook, the person nobody notices, the opportunity nobody values, the moment that seems insignificant, because God's solutions rarely arrive the way humans expect. Guided by this unexpected encounter, David found the enemy camp, and what he saw must have ignited every emotion inside him. The raiders were celebrating, feasting, drinking, acting as if their victory was complete, acting as if David's story was over, acting as if everything he loved belonged to them now. But they did not know something. The silence was over. The season was changing. The God who seemed distant had been working all along, and when David attacked, everything changed. The battle was fierce, the pursuit was relentless, but this time the outcome was different. This time David was not running. This time he was recovering. This time he was witnessing the beginning of restoration. Then came one of the most beautiful lines in the entire story. David recovered all, not some, not most, all. His family, his people, his future, his hope. Everything the enemy had stolen, recovered. Can you imagine that moment? The first embrace, the first tears of relief, the first realization that what seemed permanently lost had been returned. Perhaps David finally understood something he could not see inside the caves, something he could not see in the wilderness, something he could not see during years of silence. God had never abandoned him, not once, not in the caves, not in the wilderness, not during the unanswered prayers, not in Ziklag, not among the ashes. God was there the entire time, working, preparing, shaping, strengthening, transforming. The silence was not evidence of absence. The silence was part of the process. And perhaps this is the truth many people desperately need to hear, because there are viewers listening tonight who feel trapped inside their own wilderness, their own cave, their own unanswered prayer. They are waiting, questioning, wondering whether God has forgotten them, wondering whether heaven still sees them, wondering whether their story matters. David would understand those feelings, but if he could speak to us today, perhaps he would say this: do not judge God's presence by your circumstances. Do not measure his faithfulness by your feelings. Do not assume silence means abandonment, because some of God's greatest works happen where human eyes cannot see. And then, as if to confirm everything, another message arrived. Saul was dead. The king who had hunted David for years was gone. The chapter that seemed endless had finally ended. Think about the timing. Not years earlier when David wanted it, not months earlier when David prayed for it. At exactly the right moment, the promise was finally moving toward fulfillment. And perhaps that is one of the hardest lessons of faith. God's timing rarely matches human timing, but looking backward, David could finally see what he could never see while living through it. If God had given him the throne earlier, he would not have been ready. The caves prepared him. The wilderness prepared him. The waiting prepared him. Even the silence prepared him, because God was not merely creating a king, he was shaping a heart capable of leading people, a heart capable of humility, a heart capable of dependence, a heart that knew where true strength comes from. And maybe that is why some prayers take longer than we expect, not because God enjoys watching people suffer, but because he sees the person we are becoming. He sees what the waiting is producing. He sees what the silence is teaching. He sees what we cannot. Years later, people would remember David as a king, a warrior, a psalmist, a giant killer. But perhaps his greatest victory was not Goliath. Perhaps his greatest victory was surviving the silence, refusing to quit when heaven seemed quiet, refusing to abandon faith when answers did not come, refusing to surrender hope when circumstances made no sense, because anyone can trust God after the miracle. David learned to trust him before it, and that kind of faith changes everything. So if you find yourself in a season of silence today, do not assume the story is over. Do not assume God has forgotten you. Do not assume the waiting is meaningless. The cave is not the destination. The wilderness is not the conclusion. The silence is not the end. Sometimes, the very season that feels like God is furthest away is the season where he is preparing the greatest restoration of your life. And one day, looking back, you may discover what David discovered. God was there all along. And perhaps that is the part of David's story most people never forget. Not the giant, not the battles, not even the throne, but the silence. Because somewhere tonight, someone is sitting in their own cave. Maybe not a cave made of stone, but a cave of uncertainty, a cave of grief, a cave of disappointment, a cave of prayers that seem to go nowhere. You smile when people ask how you're doing. You keep moving forward, you keep showing up. But deep inside, there is a question you have almost stopped asking, because asking it hurts too much. God, where are you? Maybe you've prayed for healing and the pain remained. Maybe you've prayed for your marriage and the distance remained. Maybe you've prayed for direction and the confusion remained. Maybe you've prayed for someone you love, and heaven seemed silent, day after day, month after month, year after year. And if you are honest, the hardest part was never the struggle itself. The hardest part was wondering whether God still saw you, whether he still cared, whether he was still listening. David knew that feeling, not for a few days, not for a few weeks, for years. Years of silence, years of waiting, years of wondering. And yet, when David finally looked backward, he discovered something astonishing. God had been present in every moment he thought he was alone. Every cave, every wilderness, every unanswered prayer, every night of confusion, every tear, every fear, every disappointment. God was there, not always speaking, not always explaining, not always intervening the way David wanted, but always there. And perhaps that is the deepest mystery of faith. Because we often expect God to prove his presence through answers, but sometimes he proves his presence through endurance. Sometimes the miracle is not immediate deliverance. Sometimes the miracle is the strength to survive another day. The strength to keep believing, the strength to keep praying, the strength to keep walking forward when nothing makes sense. David eventually received his throne, but by then, he had gained something even more valuable, a relationship with God that no longer depended on circumstances, a faith that survived silence, a faith that survived disappointment, a faith that survived darkness. And perhaps that is the kind of faith God was building all along. Not a faith dependent on miracles, but a faith capable of surviving without them. Because one day, the cave ended, the wilderness ended, the waiting ended, the silence ended, and David finally understood what he could never understand while living through it. God was never late. God was never absent. God was never indifferent. God was preparing him, preparing his heart, preparing his character, preparing his future, preparing him for something greater than he could imagine. And maybe, just maybe, the same thing is happening in your life right now. Maybe the silence is not rejection. Maybe the waiting is not punishment. Maybe the unanswered prayer is not the end of the story. Maybe God is still writing chapters you cannot see yet. Maybe the breakthrough has not arrived because the preparation is not finished. Maybe the cave is shaping a future version of you that today's version cannot yet understand. And perhaps years from now, you will look back at this season and realize what David realized. The moments that felt most empty were actually the moments God was doing his deepest work. So before this story ends, I want to ask you something. What season are you in right now? Are you standing on a mountaintop or sitting in a cave? Are you celebrating a victory or wading through a silence that feels endless? Share your story in the comments below, not because you have all the answers, but because someone reading your words may discover they are not alone. And if this message spoke to your heart, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Sacred Truth, because in our next journey, we will uncover another hidden story from Scripture that reveals what happens when faith is tested beyond human limits. Until then, remember this: the cave is not your destination. The silence is not your identity. The waiting is not your future. And the chapter you are living today is not the final chapter, because the same God who walked with David through the wilderness still walks with his people through the darkness today. Even when heaven feels silent, especially then.